Welcome to the Polgar Chess University. In this lesson, our topic will be interesting ideas in pawn endgames. And we'll start with one of the most important subjects in pawn endgames, and that is the outside passed pawn. As we know, a passed pawn is that does not have an enemy pawn in front of it or on a neighboring file that can hold it off by itself without an other piece's help, including the king. So right now, white has a passed pawn on the A file, while black has a passed pawn on the C file. The difference is that black's C pawn is already blocked by white's king, and the other difference is that the white A pawn, passed pawn, is further away from the pawns on the other side of the board. As we shall see, that is extremely important because what happens in such situations, white uses the outside passed pawn, the far away passed pawn, as a bait to give it up in order to force the black king to move towards that pawn, the A pawn, to stop it from promoting or to capture it when the pawn promotes. However, what happens then, the black king gets all the way to the edge of the board, to the A file, while the white king is much closer to all the pawns on the other side. Let's see how that plays out in a real situation. White right now should start advancing the pawn and trying to make it a queen. Naturally, black will try to hold that off. King c6, and white now advances further. Of course, the white king cannot think about going to the king's side while black's pawn on c5 may just run away. So white right now is busy holding off black's c5 pawn. At this point, black can make a waiting move by playing f6. And now, if white would move the king back anywhere on the third rank, black would even win the game by moving the king to b5 next to white's pawn, and then the pawn would be lost without the white king winning black's passed pawn in time. So let's go back, and white continues by playing a6. Now the black king must move, as none of the black pawns are able to. King b6, and here comes the main idea that we're forcing the black king to prevent the A pawn to promote, and the only way black can do that is moving away from his own c5 pawn. So what we see right now, that we exchanged the outside passed pawn for black's passed pawn on the c file, and the white king is much closer to the pawns on the f file than black's, and therefore black will not arrive timely to protect at least one of those pawns. Let's say black plays king b7, starts running, and then white continues by playing king to d6, for example king c8, king e7, and now the black king has been shouldered. When the king, at the same time that it attacks going after enemy pawns and also keeps the enemy king away in trying to protect those pawns, that's called shouldering. So now the black king cannot go to the d file, must make a waiting move, for example king c7, and white is free to capture these black pawns one by one. And now the black king is just one move too far. If right now black could gain the opposition and move the king to f7, the game would be a draw. However, obviously the king cannot jump and must make moves one by one to e7, and now white is winning by moving the king to g6, opening up the road of the f file. If the black king tries to stay under the promotion square, won't be able to stay forever, would come f5, king g8, f6, king f8, f7, and we reached one of the most typical pawn endgames when black is in zugzwang, which means black must move and therefore lose the game. If black would say, I pass, I don't need to move, then the game would be a draw. But black cannot do that. The king must get out, and now the king assists the f pawn in promoting on the next move. White wins. Let's see another similar example on the same theme. Right now again, white has 2 pawns versus black's 2 pawn, but white has an outside passed pawn. Moreover, black does not even have a passed pawn, right? Because the one pawn on b4 is holding off both black pawns. Not just the b5 pawn that literally cannot move, but also the c6 pawn, which is allowed to move but would be captured right away if it advances to c5. Again, what white is doing is advancing the outside passed pawn, keeping the black king busy, and while black is going pawn hunting, making sure that h-pawn doesn't get promoted, the white king real quick runs over to the other side of the board and eats up the pawns, and again the black king arrives too late, even later than in the previous example where black missed it just by one move. In this case, black is way off, missing it by 3 moves. If now the black king could move to b7 to keep up position, the game would be a draw. Otherwise, black is losing. Let's move on to another endgame on the same theme. Right now, there are equal number of pawns, 3 each, and the big difference is, compared to the previous 2 examples, that white doesn't yet have a passed pawn. So the task is to create one. The way we create a passed pawn is to use our connected pawns, which are on g4 and h3 at the moment, and advance them together. So after the g5 move, when black would capture, we would want to be able to recapture, and then white would have a passed pawn. Also, it is extremely important in pawn endgames to activate your king. The easiest way to win here is to play king f4, and then black would play king f6, trying to prevent the white king from entering on e5. Now it's time to bring our assistant, the h pawn, by playing h4. So now we can see a similar idea. White is about to play g5. King f7, and now we're activating the king. That's always good. Now the black king is busy hanging on to the e6 pawn. King e7, and voila, here we come, g5. We created a passed pawn. Black trades, and we take back. Now if black is just waiting, the g pawn would just advance, again deflecting the black king from protecting the e6 and d5 pawns. For example, king f7, and now there are multiple ways to win, the simplest being just playing king d6, putting black in zugzwang. The black king must leave the protection of the e6 pawn, and then white just eats up those 2 pawns, and after that promotes the d pawn. Of course, it's worth mentioning that after e5, it's simplest to capture the e5 pawn with a king, and not with a pawn, not allowing black to create a passed pawn on the d file, which could also then advance. King e5 kills any of black's hopes and counterplay, and then the d5 pawn falls as well. Let's see now some totally different elements in pawn endgames. Here we go. In this position, white has an extra pawn. All the pawns are very far advanced and close to the promotion square. However, there is a major difference between white's pawns and black's. The white king has no hope whatsoever to catch the black pawn. As we know, both the king and the pawn generally can move only one square at a time. The pawn can do sometimes two squares at a time, but that's only when a pawn is still in its initial square. Once the pawn has moved, the pawn also can move only one square. So therefore, in a situation like this, there is no potential way or hope for the king to catch the pawn that is behind the pawn. So therefore, white's only hope is to promote his own pawn. However, even that may not be enough to win, because queen versus queen is a draw, and most queen and pawn versus queen endgames are drawn too. However, this is an exceptional situation, and I'd like you to pay attention to the pattern that I'm about to illustrate. The white king moves to e6. The challenge is in this situation that the black king is holding off the white pawns, while the white king, as we said, cannot catch black's. Now, let's see what happens if black advances the h-pawn. Here comes the trick. King e7. Wow, and the black pawn already promoted. That sounds like trouble. Not quite. White did this on purpose. Now white, of course, has to give a check, start making forceful moves. And now we'll see both variations, what happens if the king goes to c7 or it goes to b8. Let's start with king c7 first. Then the pawn advances naturally to promote a queen. And now black has only one legal move, capturing the pawn. And this is one of the typical situations when queen versus queen is not a draw. It is not a draw if one side has the ability to win the other side's queen right away. And this is one of those situations when the king and the queen are lined up on the same diagonal and the other side is able to create a skewer, giving a check, and then if the king moves, the black queen falls in the corner. Let's go back again to the beginning. So we said we play king e6, h2, king e7, pawn promotes, pawn checks, and now let's see the other variation. What happens if the black king goes to b8? Then again, the pawn promotes to a queen, king a7, and amazingly now, white is ready to checkmate in just 3 moves. If right now white would be advancing the c6 pawn to c7, that would be a major mistake, because on one hand it would miss the opportunity to give checkmate in just 3 moves, but also it would ruin the game because black would get the opportunity to give unlimited number of checks. That's one of the major issues when we are playing queen endgames, that since most of the pieces are off the board, there are an amazing amount of checks available, and it's very hard to find a hiding place, since there are no other pieces to hide behind. Of course, in some situations, the side with the extra pawn is able to block a check with the queen, but in this situation, that seems hard to do. So, can you see the checkmate in 3? It's all forced. Check, check, checkmate. And the answer is playing queen a5 check, giving black only one legal option, king b8, then queen b6, and regardless which direction the black king goes, whether it's a8 or c8, voila, here it is, checkmate. Very nice. Let's go back one last time and see what would happen if after king e6, black would try to prevent the white king in getting to e7. Well, in that case, white would simply advance the c-pawn with a check, king c8, and again come to the aid of the pawn king e7. Now black is a move too late. h2, d7 check, and if king captures pawn, the pawn promotes, with a check, very importantly, and then the queen can move behind black's pawn and simply be ready to capture that pawn, whether it advances to become a queen or not. Okay, let's see the next example. Here we go. Now this is another different situation again, when there are no passed pawns and the black king is right there in the middle, holding off white's pawns and not allowing white to create easily a passed pawn. Also, it's not so easy because I'll show you some examples. If white carelessly creates a passed pawn, it may still be a draw, considering the black king is right there under it. The first thing to understand that playing king c4 right now, being the most natural move, would spoil the game immediately, and this is a very nice little trick worth remembering. Black would be able to play d5, and then, sacrificing a pawn, put white into a zugzwang situation where now white has no choice but give up the d5 pawn, and then, as we learned in one of the earlier lessons, we know this is a draw. When there is only one pawn and it's directly blockaded, it's always a draw. So now that we know what not to do, it's time to try to figure out what we should do. Well, the way to do it is to go around, play king c3. Now, if black would attempt the same, playing d5, of course the response would be not to trade on d5, neither to play king d3, both would result in a theoretically drawn position, but to create a protected passed pawn. In most cases, in a pawn endgame, if you can create a protected passed pawn, just like here, it almost always guarantees a win. Not always, we shall see an exception when not, but most of the time it guarantees a rather easy win. The reason being that the black king will never be able to come behind and attack any of those pawns, because as soon as the king would move to e4 in a situation like this, the e-pawn would run away and become a queen very quickly. So therefore, the white king would have all the liberty to go after black's pawns, while the black king is stuck in holding off the advancement of white's protected passed pawn, in this case on e5. But let's see, after king c3, what happens if black does not play d5, but just keeps kind of making a waiting move. After king c3, king d7, and now king b4, king c6, king a5, king b7, king b5, and black slowly but surely is running out of moves. If the white king gets to come to c6, of course the d6 pawn will be in serious danger. King c7, king a6, king c6. As we can see, black desperately is trying to keep away white's king from his own very last pawn on d6. And now comes the key moment. If white wants to make progress, white at one point needs to play d5, and this is the perfect time. Now the black king needs to let the white king come closer. If the king goes to c5, white's king would go to b7, and then it would go to c6, attacking the pawn, and after king e5, a simple king c7 move would put black in zugzwang, in need to give up the pawn on d6. Or, if going back just a little bit, after king b5 and king c7, king a6, king c6, and white plays d5 and black responds with king c7, then king a7, and as we can see, black is losing space and the white king will succeed in getting closer to the pawn on d6, king d7, king b7, king e8, king c7, king a7, king c6, and black suffers because they need to make a move. So such endgames that we saw right here, very basic endgame with multiple pawns, with one side having an extra pawn, most of the time are rather easy wins. So generally, you want to avoid a pawn endgame without a pawn when you're down a pawn, unless you know specifically that it is a theoretical draw. Most other pawn endgames are simply easily lost. The next example will be one of those exceptions. When in this position, even though white has an extra pawn, even though white's extra pawn is a protected passed pawn, the game is draw. The reason being that the limitation of the board, the fact that the black king is in the corner area and the white king is not able to go around the h pawns. Also, because of the location of the pieces, there are numerous stalemate situations that can end the game in a draw. For example, if white right now plays king f6, black can respond with king f8, after g7 play king g8, and now the only way to hang on to that g7 pawn would be to play king g6, and that would result stalemate. And of course, stalemate ends the game in a draw. There is no way for white to make progress in this position. The game is draw. The reason why it is important to learn endgames, and specifically starting with pawn endgames, because during your games there are always opportunities to exchange pieces. And it's especially crucial when we're down to those last few pieces. Should we trade or shouldn't we? And not knowing what the resulting endgame is can cost you valuable half or full points. Let's just see finally in this lesson a couple of examples of that. In this situation, of course this resembles largely the very last example, but there are still a pair of rooks. Knowing what we know from the previous example, we can conclude that exchanging rooks would give away the game, and the game should end in a draw if black defends properly. On the other hand, white could win finding the right choice and knowing to avoid the drawn pawn endgame. White now should play rook c7 instead, and black now is in a losing situation as if king h8 the checkmate arrives, or if the king goes to f8 instead in the first move, then white can play king e6 or king f6, now threatening to checkmate with rook c8, and black, while can avoid the immediate checkmate, it will cost the rook. And our final example for this lesson, another situation where black has the opportunity to trade or not to trade. Of course, black could start playing with queen e1 check and try to hang on to the game by giving an enormous amount of checks. However, knowing the correct evaluation, an experienced player would simply exchange the queens and then gain the opposition and draw the game for sure. For example, king e5, king e7, keeping the opposition, which is being symmetrical, the two kings, with an odd number of squares in between them. After d5, king d7, d6, and once the pawn is ahead of the king, that's when it's very important to make sure we bring the king in the middle, not to either side of the pawn. To be ready that when the king moves next to the pawn, then we play king e8 opposite the king again, and after check, king d6, the game is stalemate again, draw. Well, I hope you got a little better ideas about pawn endgames. Thanks for listening, and bye-bye until next time.